Jacob awoke in the dead of the night. The hair on the back of his neck was standing on end. There was something out in the encampment. Was it his brother come to kill him? Was it a wild beast? Was it a demon? He had no idea. What would you do? He got up and woke up his family and 1, 2, okay, we're back. It's going to be a fun morning. So he got them all up and took them across the ford of the Jabbok River. And then alone, unarmed, in the dead of the night, he walked back into that encampment. And something grabbed him and threw him to the ground. And he reached over and he grabbed it, and they wrestled back and forth and struggled. He could not prevail. Whatever it was didn't win either. So they struggled for a long time until gradually the eastern sky began to turn gray with the beginning of the dawn. And so this entity, whatever it was, spoke for the first time and said, "Release me, for I must go." Jacob said no. And so it reached over and with one finger dislocated his hip. Whoa, this thing was much more powerful than it had let on. It hurt. "Release me, for I must go." What would you do? He said no. "What must I do to get you to release me?" How many know what it said? "You must give me your blessing. You must give me your blessing." So the demon turned out to be an angel. And it said to him, "Your name will no longer be Jacob. From now on, your name will be Israel. And from you, an entire nation will descend." And for those people at that culture at that time, that was the highest blessing anyone could imagine. So Jacob released the angel, it left, and then he limped into the sunrise. It's a hazy afternoon in Tokyo. The commuter train was half full, a few late afternoon shoppers, a few early commuters. And suddenly that tranquil atmosphere was shattered by this bellicose voice, cursing almost incomprehensible invectives. And the door of the train slammed open, and this big man staggered in. And he was dirty, and he was drunk, and he looked around, and he sneered at everyone. There was a woman holding a small child near the door there, and he swung at them with the back of his hand and sent them spinning into the lap of an elderly couple. It was a miracle no one was hurt. So the woman and her child scurried back to the far end of the train, and all the people around that door, they scurried away too, and as they ran, he kicked at them. And when he missed, he became so enraged that he reached down and tried to pull one of the benches up off the floor of the train car. And as he did so, he cut his hand and was bleeding and dripping. And just then, the car doors slammed shut, and the train lurched as it started to roll out of the station. And everyone froze. They were trapped with this maniac. Also on the train that day was a man by the name of Terry Dobson. I understand he lives in the Boston area now, but this was in his early years. And he had been in Tokyo studying Aikido, 8 hours a day for 3 years. And as you probably know, Aikido is a form of martial arts, a very, very effective means of fighting. And Terry thought of himself as being pretty good. And he loved to grapple. But his one regret was that his martial skills had never been tried in actual combat. Because as a student of the martial arts, he was not allowed to fight. His teacher would say, the essence of Aikido is the art of reconciliation. Whoever has the mind to defeat another has already lost. If you would dominate someone else, your connection with life has been broken. We study how to resolve conflicts, not how to start them. So Terry had a great deal of respect for his master, and he listened carefully to his words, and he went so far as to cross to the other side of the street to avoid some of the punks that hung out around the train station. He felt exalted in his forbearance. He felt tough and holy. But deep in his heart of hearts, he yearned for the absolutely legitimate excuse to save the innocent by destroying the wicked. This is it, he thought. If I don't do something, someone's going to get hurt. So he rose from his seat and stood there looking at the big drunk, who saw him and saw an opportunity to focus all his rage on one person. And he gathered himself to rush at Terry, but before he could move, someone said, "Hey!" It was ear-splitting. And it had this slightly lilting quality to it, as if you and a friend had lost something very precious and you had been looking for it, and suddenly you came about it. "Hey!" So the drunk wheeled to his right and Terry wheeled to his left. And there, sitting on one of the benches, was this elderly Japanese gentleman dressed immaculately in a coat and tie. And he was just beaming delightedly up at this drunk. He waved to him and said, "Come here," talking in easy vernacular. "Come here, I want to talk to you." The big man staggered over and planted his feet and said, "Why the heck should I talk to you?" The little man just looked up with his eyes sparkling and he said, "What you been drinking?" The big man said, "I've been drinking sake, and it's none of your damn business." "Oh, that's wonderful. That's just wonderful," he said. Me and my wife, she's 86, we like sake too. And every night we take our little bit of sake out in the back and we sit on the bench that my grandfather made for us, and we like to see how the garden is doing. And we especially like to see how the persimmons tree is doing. We worry about it with all these storms coming through. Actually, it has done quite well when you consider the quality of the soil. It's so wonderful just to sit out there and look at our persimmons tree and drink our sake. Well, the laborer's eyes began to soften, and he looked slightly confused as he tried to follow the old man's conversation, and finally he said, "Yeah, I like persimmons too." And the little man wasn't paying any attention to Terry, but he kept on just smiling up at this big drunk, and he said, "And I bet you have a lovely wife too." "Nah," he replied, "my wife died." And gradually he began to rock back and forth with the movement of the train. "I ain't got no wife. I ain't got no job. I ain't got no home. I feel so ashamed," and these tears were rolling down his cheeks and the spasms of despair coming through his body. Meanwhile, Terry is there, feeling dirtier than the drunk. His well-scrubbed innocence and his make the world safe for democracy. He felt pretty terrible. By that time, the train had started to slow down to come into Terry's stop, so as the doors opened, he heard the old man cluck sympathetically, My, that is a difficult predicament indeed. You better come sit down here and tell me about that." And Terry stepped off the train and turned around and looked back, and there was the drunk lying on his back on the car seat with his head in the old man's lap, who was stroking his filthy, matted hair. A few moments later, Terry was standing alone on that train station there, watching the train clatter on down the track. And he thought, at last I've seen Aikido, tried in actual combat. And its essence is love. The bellicose, dirty drunkard is us. We all have parts of ourselves we don't like. You know, little bits of coveting, unkind thoughts, times when we've, shaded the truth a little bit, not stayed true to our values, misdeeds, doubts. We all carry some measure of unworthiness. Thank you so much for sharing so many. We all have our list, right? We all have our list. Sometimes these parts of ourselves just hide under rocks. Sometimes they whisper to us from the shadows, and sometimes, as with Terry, they jump out in the broad daylight and run havoc on our journey home. Seems like many of them are running for political office these days. These demons and drunkards and other shady creatures are just an inevitable part of our life from time to time, for all of us. And how we greet them is a deep reflection on how we are able to greet the whole of life. When we do something wonderful, it's really easy to feel good about ourselves. But when we failed, are disappointed, do we greet ourselves with the intolerance and indignation and disgust, as Terry did? Or do we greet it with the gentle kindness of the old man? So the stories we've shared this morning look at all these kind of different ways that we can greet the unwelcome parts of ourselves. But they're not discrete strategies. They fit onto a continuum. And so this morning, I would just like to describe this continuum for you. At one end of the spectrum is denial, right? The proverbial ostrich with its head in the sand. We find this reflected in phrases like, you gotta be positive. Don't dwell on things like that. A short while ago, when I asked you to think about some parts of yourself you're not fond of, maybe some of you had trouble thinking of anything. Let me help you out. Just imagine that I have this magic belt, okay? And when you put the belt on, everybody within about 50 feet of you can hear every thought that goes through your head. You won't be able to hear them, but they know everything that goes through your mind. Okay, you got it. So, would you like to put that belt on before you go to work? When you go shopping? Who would like to put it on now? So, we all have embarrassing thoughts, fantasies, yearnings, misdeeds, things that we just, would rather keep to ourselves. Thank you very much. We all have aspects of ourselves we would just as soon forget. So as we move across the spectrum a little bit, we come to this area which is the Clint Eastwood School of Inner Development, whose motto is, if you don't like it, kill it. Okay. So Terry Dobson, early in that story represents that. Worries are seen as things that we must overpower, to defeat. This is similar to ignoring the demons in the sense that we don't learn anything from them. We're busy trying to forget them or stomp them into the ground. A teacher of mine once said that pain is the soul's way of bringing our attention to that which needs attention. And the way the mind does that sometimes is not terribly skillful. Like sometimes they think the universe has Asperger's. If it's more than we can handle, it doesn't know to back off. It just keeps, rubbing our nose in it. It's up to us to bring the wisdom to that. So we partner with it long enough for it to impart some kind of wisdom or get the demon's blessing, as in Jacob's case. If we keep moving up, eventually we come to the next spot on the spectrum, which is represented by that little Japanese gentleman extending the kindness to this seeming maniac. The great Tibetan saint Milarepa lived and meditated in caves for years. And he said demons used to come to visit him from time to time. And he said he never tried to keep them out. He would always invite them in for tea. So which of your demons are you willing to invite in for tea? Which ones are you willing to befriend, to open up to and befriend? The final way of working with the demons is to become them. To become them. This is tricky. This is tricky. To understand what this means, we need to understand the very nature of fear and pain, and particularly how they relate to aversion. There's not enough time to go into all of that this morning, but let me give you an example and an image, which I think will illustrate it. When I was a little kid, and I had a loose tooth, and if you're like me, when you had a loose tooth, I like to wiggle it. My mother would say, "Don't do that." So I put my hands down and I wiggle it with my tongue. And it created this sharp sensation, but you wouldn't really call it hurt because there's so much curiosity and interest in it. And we can imagine someone else who was really scared of that sensation and didn't like it all. And for them, it would be suffering. There'd be a lot of suffering involved in it. The sensation is exactly the same. But in one case, it wears the mask of curiosity and wonder. And the other wears the mask of a demon. So merging with the demons is not merging with the masks. It's merging with the raw sensation underneath it. You have to let go of the mask and go underneath it. So for example, I woke up the other morning and I was feeling a little down. And I recognized this place of quiet fear inside me. But I didn't know what it was about. I had some worries about my kids. There were some financial strains. There was some vulnerabilities that I'd shared with the group. And as I mulled these over, the sensation in my belly didn't change at all. It just was a lump at my belly. So I just set all those explanations aside and brought my attention down into the sensation itself. It's what I was trying to encourage you to do in that guided meditation. And the first thing that happens when you really start to let down into those is it gets worse. Right? A little bit of fear or whatever, it gets a little stronger. But if you keep softening and opening and just dropping down into it, quietly underneath that, I hope many of you could experience this, there's a kind of a tenderness underneath it. Again, without that tenderness, we wouldn't hurt. And if you soften and open up into that, underneath that, there's a very quiet openness that can get hidden under all the stuff on top. But it's actually, right now, as you sit here listening to me, if you can feel back there behind it all, there's a place of stillness and quiet. It doesn't jump up and down and draw our attention, but it's been there, it's always been there. So we can let down and open up into that quiet and that spaciousness. And that's the beginning of freedom. That's the beginning of freedom. So what happens is a lot of people would like to get to that sense of freedom, but they want to do an end run, not go through the tenderness and all the rest of that. It just doesn't work. I don't know why it doesn't work, I just know it doesn't work. So we have to go through it all. Touch into the energy, if you will. And as we do that, we experience some quiet aliveness. And the demon is transformed. And so are we. And so are we. Don't get me wrong, I'm not of that school of thought that says no pain, no gain. I think sometimes there's a lot of gain without pain. But I do think the opposite is true. If we avoid pain, we avoid gain. If we try to avoid pain, then our progress just comes to a screeching halt and we enter into what Henry David Thoreau called lives of quiet despair. So we must hear what those places underneath are saying to us. And listen to what they have to say, wrestle with them, become them, interact with them in some way. Then we can turn back towards the light and go on with much more lightness because we have their energy. So again, our attitude towards our fears and doubts and misgivings are a deep reflection of our attitude towards life itself. Some people see life as something they have to do. You know, it's a project to be completed, a mystery to be solved, you know, a challenge to be conquered. For other people, life is something that happens to them. It's a burden to be borne, an annoyance to be ignored, a soap opera to be endured. But when we are willing to engage the demons as friends and lovers, then life becomes a dance to be danced.